Avraham Zokein Bo Bayomim. Avraham is old, advanced in days. Hashem Berach as Avraham Ba Kol. Hashem blessed Avraham with everything. And we mentioned yesterday, Rashi explains that the gematria of Ba Kol is Ben. Ba Kol is Ben, numerical value Ba Kol. And Rashi says now that he has the son, because he was not killed, was not slaughtered at the Akedah, he has to locate a wife for him. As we mentioned, after the Akedah, Avraham was informed by Hashem that Rivka was born, and therefore he's guaranteed everything's in place. He just has to wait for that moment for it to mature to a point, and then he will act and bring her back to Canaan. And that's at this moment, 3 years have passed since the Akedah, and he summons his dedicated slave, Eliezer, instructs him very specifically which woman qualifies, that he should be able to locate that woman. And although Eliezer questioned, maybe the woman wouldn't want to come back, or whatever the question may be, nevertheless, Avraham says, Hashem will send his malach. Hashem was confident. Avraham was confident, or he communicated, he was confident, it's going to be okay. Hashem will send his angel to make sure that the right woman is brought back to be the future matriarch of the Jewish people. So if you read the story as it reads, the narrative, Avraham had tremendous bitochon. If God gave Avraham a son miraculously to be born to him at the age of 100, and Hashem had told him, your son will be the future of the world. He will meet the objective of creation. To be one of the founding fathers of the Jewish people, you need the matriarch. And if the matriarch is not qualified, it's not going to happen. So you'd say it's based on that. However, it was even more than that, because as I said, Avraham was informed right after the Akedah, when he was told not to slaughter his son, that the wife was born to him at that moment. And it's just a question he has to wait. If that's the case, Eliezer has to just be given instruction how to locate that wife, how will come upon that wife. So it wasn't just bitochon, it was his faith in God. At that moment, he has faith, it's going to work out. But he had enough guarantees, and he had enough information, and he was informed directly that the wife was born to Yitzchak, who's the future matriarch. But this is something which he did not share with Eliezer, because if he would have shared it with him, he wouldn't have asked all the questions. Maybe she won't want to come. Should I bring your son there? There's no basis for any of those questions. Now, I'd mentioned, says Hashem had blessed him with everything. And Rashi says to the Medrash that Ba Kol numerically is Ben. The first time the word Ben is mentioned in Torah is at the time of the birth of Noach. When Noach was born, it says that Lemech, who was his father, had a son, Ben. And Rashi says, why was Noach called Ben? Shu binyano shel olam. Because he is the structure or the building of the world. From him, the world will build at that moment. But that's what the Torah is informing us, that he's the future of existence. I mean, it's foretelling the world will be destroyed. So why will the world regenerate itself? That's Ben, that's Binyanush, he is Binyanush Shel Olam. The Torah is telling us of here that Ba Kol is Ben. That's everything. So simply everything means that despite all Avram's successes, all the wealth, all the renown he had, but what was the true bracha to Avram? He blessed him with everything. What's everything to Ben? That was it. He had Yitzchak. Everything was meaningless. Pale to that. The word pale is an understatement. Had no value, had no meaning. All that mattered was that he had Yitzchak, he had the son, to be a successor, to perpetuate what he does, and to be one of the founding fathers of Klal Yisrael. That's everything. But I was thinking, as over there, Noach was Ben, because he was the world, the future of the world. Over here, when Yitzchak was born, that is the world. That's Ba Kol. That's Ben. Ba Kol is Ben. Because the world is irrelevant if not for Klal Yisrael. As we said, what was the intention of creation? Atem kriyim Adam. Adam, a person who's able to advance his spirituality. Adam, after he ate of the tree of knowledge, he ingested that evil, he was disenfranchised. He was no longer Adam. He no longer had the ability to advance his spirituality. God created man initially, he should have that ability to advance his spirituality. Klal Yisrael took over that role, and that's Atem Kriyim Adam. You have that characteristic, which no one else has. And that's the objective of creation. So if that's the case, Ba Kol means it's all-encompassing. The ben that Avraham had, which is Binyanu Shalom as the Noach, that is Ba Kol. Not only Ba Kol for Avraham, it's Ba Kol. That everything paled to that, but it was everything, because everything is the world. And what is the world? The world is Bereshis Bar Elokim, for the sake of Torah and for the sake of the Jewish people. That's the Ba Kol. Ernie, ask a question. Okay. Ernie.
Yeah. Is there any reason that is there any reason why Abraham could not go and he had to send Eliezer?
So, as I said, the commentators say is because he was old and it was too difficult for him. What I would say that until Yitzchak married Rivka, Avram was the patriarch. The patriarch has a role. Not only is his role in terms of his dimension of being vis-a-vis Klal Yisrael, in terms of who he was as an influencer, he was integral. He was originally told, go to the land that I will show you. There you'll be effective. So Avram, within the role of his role, he's going to be effective as the patriarch and so as the matriarch. Until Yitzchak himself marries Rivka, Yitzchak's not the matriarch, and Rivka, because a patriarch needs a matriarch. As a result of that, Avram had to remain in Canaan because that's the land that he showed him, because he's still functioning in that original capacity as patriarch. The moment he leaves Canaan, who's going to assume that responsibility, which initially was given when he was told, go to the land that I will show you? So since it could be delegated through Eliezer, if under the instruction that he was given to guarantee that he's bringing back that the proper wife who will be the matriarch, therefore Avram cannot leave. I'll give you an example. A Kohen Gadol, a high priest, is not permitted to contaminate even for his closest relatives. No ordinary Kohen, for his parents, for his wife, for his children, for his siblings, he could contaminate. A Kohen Gadol, a high priest, cannot. The only person he could be contaminated for is a mes mitzvah. The Jew is found unattended to, that's the only overriding factor. Why? Because the Kohen Gadol, in terms of his status, who he was, as we discussed, he is the epitome of Adam in terms of the vestments and everything else. And he is the officiant at that exceptional level. If he contaminates himself, he becomes contaminated. He himself, that connection as that function that he plays, who's going to replace it? Therefore, he cannot put that in jeopardy. Identically, Avram, until he has a patriarch to fulfill his role as patriarch, he's not permitted to leave his watch. This is his watch. So therefore, since he was able to delegate it to Eliezer, therefore he did not leave the land. It's interesting. We find that the function of Avram and the function of Yitzchak was a different function as patriarch. Each one of the patriarchs functioned in another capacity. They were all patriarchs. They were all Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak. They were the location of the divine presence, which is the equivalent of the Holy of Holies. as we said, in the name of the Midrash, Heinein HaMerkava, they were the location of the Shechina before the Mishkan was built. That's where God's location was. So therefore, Avraham being the Merkava, that's in Eretz Yisrael. So I was thinking, just as Avraham could not leave Eretz Yisrael, the land of Canaan, because that was his location, a function. Yitzhak later, at the time of the famine, wanted to leave the land. Hashem says, remain in the land. So Rashi cites Chazal, because since Yitzhak was the unblemished offering, and just as you can't take an offering outside of the confines of the sanctuary, identically, Yitzhak cannot be taken out of should not leave the borders of Israel. Leaving Eretz Yisrael is like going out of the sanctuary. And Yitzhak being the Karban, the consecrated sacrifice, you can't leave. I was thinking what we're saying now, you could say differently, without Chazal, that the patriarch has a function. Every patriarch, his function was in Eretz Yisrael. That's what he was meant to be. As a result of this, the moment he leaves the confines of Eretz Yisrael, that's not his location of function. Therefore, Hashem says, remain in the land. Not because he was consecrated, but rather because he assumed the role of patriarch, and Rivka, matriarch, is Eretz Yisrael. That's why he couldn't leave the land, because that's where he was meant to function. Although we find Yaakov was a patriarch and matriarch outside of Eretz Yisrael, because he married Rachel and Leah. He married in Choron, in Aram Naraim. That's where it was, Aram Naraim, where that was the original location where the family came from. But that's where he became patriarch. He became the patriarch not in Eretz Yisrael. But if you become the patriarch in Eretz Yisrael, your function is limited there. You're not supposed to leave the land. Although Yaakov did leave, right? 17 years before he passed away, he went to Mitzrayim, he went to Egypt. Yosef was there. The last 17 years of his life he spent in Egypt as patriarch, but there was under God's instruction. That's the reason he went. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gone. He wouldn't have left the land because he understood his location, his place was there, not to leave. Hashem says, no, you leave. You have nothing to worry about. You leave the land. That's firstly. Secondly, there's a famous word from Rabbeinu Simcha Vince that once the 12 tribes were born, until the 12 tribes were born, Yaakov was involved in outreach, as Avraham was involved in outreach, and Yitzhak was involved, we'll discuss later, at a certain point in outreach. Once the 12 tribes were born, the entity of spirituality was self-contained. He was not involved in outreach any longer. Just having the entity of the Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people, gave off an energy to the world, which allowed the world to come to a level of clarity without them being proactive in going to convert people to monotheism. There was enough of a presence of truth, which was being generated by Yaakov's family, it wasn't necessary any longer. As a result of that, his function as patriarch wasn't no longer the same, because the outreach initially was supposed to be in Canaan. So if you leave, who's going to assume that task, that responsibility? Yaakov, once he had his children, he had the family, as he said, he went with 70 individuals. 70 members of his family went to Egypt. 70 was the number which corresponded to the 70 nations of the world when he went to Egypt. So Yaakov was self-contained. Once you're self-contained, you're going with your whole entourage, which is the world, the equivalent of the world, you're going to Egypt. Therefore, Hashem had instructed Yaakov, you should go to Egypt and you have nothing to worry about. You go there, you pass away there, and your son, Yosef, will bring you back, which is what actually happened. Eliezer, earlier, when Avraham was told that he was going to have, the land is his, it will be his and his children, Avraham says to Hashem, what's the good of it all? I have no child. My servant, domestic Eliezer, will be my heir. So Hashem says, no, you have nothing to worry about. your shecha. The one who will leave your innards will be your heir. You'll have a physical child. So we asked them, Hashem originally said to Avraham, you will have a child. He says, well, but I have no child. My heir is going to be my slave. Damesik Eliezer will be my child. So what does the word Damesik mean? The word Damesik literally means he came from Damascus. Eliezer came from Damascus. But Chazal tell us Damesik Eliezer is an acronym. Dole Umashkim Torah Sharabo. He drew from the wellsprings of the Torah of his teacher, of Avraham. That whatever Torah Avraham knew, he taught to Eliezer, and Eliezer disseminated the Torah that was taught to him by Avraham. That was the extent of his Torah knowledge. So he said at that time, I have no child, Damesik Eliezer Yoroshosi, my Damesik Eliezer will inherit me. If he says from Damascus, okay, he's just identifying who he is. But if the word Damesik is alluding to his dimension of Torah, that all the Torah that he himself knew, Eliezer drew from the wellsprings of that Torah, what relevance does it have to this moment? So what I said was, the Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin that Torah leben chavero is kilu yoldo. That if you teach Torah to a fellow Jew, to the child of a fellow, and you mentor him in Torah, it's as if you actually fathered that child. That meaning we're talking about the majority of the Torah is taught to that person. The teacher is considered of the spiritual father of that child. Kilu yoldo. If that is the case, Avram said, since Eliezer advanced through Torah to that special level, maybe the child that he was meant to have was the spiritual child. And that's why when he referred to Eliezer will be his heir, he just didn't refer to him as Eliezer will be my heir. Damesik Eliezer. Eliezer who drew from my well springs and I taught all my Torah to, he will be my son. And that Hashem says, no. The one who comes out of your womb, out of your innards, he will be your son. But that was the back and forth of what? Of Avram's concern that he made out of his own son and maybe his spiritual son. Shem says, no, it's going to be your real son. It's going to be your biological son. Will be heir. But now, we find in the Medrash in this week's Parsha that when Eliezer went to Aram Naraim, to the community where Rivka was, and initially Lavan had come out to see who this person was because he saw the bracelets and the nose ring, and he came running to see what this is all about, and he sees Eliezer. And when he sees Eliezer, you know what he thinks he's seeing? Eliezer is radiating the way Avram radiated. The holy Avram, when you looked at him, he didn't look like an ordinary person. He had a radiance coming out of him. As Moshe Rabbeinu radiated, which was another level, Avram radiated holiness. Eliezer radiated a similar radiance like Avram. When he looked at Eliezer, he thought he was looking at Avram. So the question is, but Eliezer, firstly, is a Canaanite. Eliezer is a slave. Eliezer doesn't have the pedigree of Avram, but yet he radiates like his Rebbe. Now, what is the source of that radiance? Since he's Damesik Eliezer, he's Dodo Mashkini Toroso Shorabo. He draws from the wellsprings of the Torah of his Rebbe, and it says, Kol Masher Lomad Avram Limed Eliezer. Whatever Avram learned, he communicated, he transmitted to Eliezer. So Eliezer was the repository of all the Torah that Avram had. And his function was, he was a disseminator of the Torah that Avram had known. So if that's the case, he was spiritualized as an extension of his Rebbe, of his master, Avram. Therefore, when Lavan had seen him, he thought he was looking at an Avram. And it's unbelievable. You read the Medrash, Lavan was a bad person. He initially tried to kill. As we find later, they tried to poison Eliezer. They said, once sit down, have a meal. And who's negotiating over here? The Suel, who's the father of Rivka, and Lavan. And by the end of the story, there's no mention of Besuel any longer. There's only Lavan and his mother. What happened to Besuel? So Rashi brings the Chazal, the Midrash, that when Eliezer originally said, Eliezer, let's have a meal. He says, look, I have to talk business first. I'm here for a mission. After we speak about my mission, we'll have the meal. He sits down to the meal. Guess what? Besuel dies during the meal. Why? Because a malach came and switched the portion that was meant to be for Eliezer, it was given to Besuel. So Besuel died of poisoning. You understand? But initially, when he came, Lavan wanted to kill Avraham. Kill Eliezer because he thought this was Avraham. Just as Esav, we say later, Arami Ovid Ovi, that the Aramean Lavan wanted to kill Yaakov and his family when he fled, because Yaakov represented that level of spirituality. Avraham, which that was the foundation of that spirituality, he wanted to destroy that also. So when he saw Eliezer, he wanted to kill Eliezer. But miraculously, Eliezer was able to ascend, and he wasn't able to touch him. The Medrash says, he said one of the names of Hashem, and he ascended, and he couldn't come near him. That's the only reason why. Otherwise, he would have tried. He will try to kill him. If you read the parsha, Eliezer, from the time that Avraham summoned him, Eliezer was no simple person. He's identified as what? As Zakan Beso. He's the elder of Avram's house. He's Moshe B'cholat Shalom. He oversees all his financial dealings, all his assets. We're talking about this man. He controls the world economy. That's the breadth and depth of his capacity. And he's never ever mentioned by name. He's referred to as a slave, the elder of his household. When Eliezer even identifies himself, he says, I am the slave of Avraham. He doesn't say, I am this with PhD, and he has all his tombstones on his desk, Jay. You hear that? No tombstones. Tombstones belong in the cemetery. That doesn't belong on your desk, the tombstones. Cohen can't walk into your office. You got to be careful. The guy coming and doing the deal, his name better not be Cohen or Schwartz, right? Or Kagan, the Kohanim. You see the level of negation, despite his dimension of being. To what degree was Eliezer negated to his master? He had no identity. Relating to anything what had to do with Avraham, he had no identity. It only speaks about his ability, but he as a person, he had no identity, which is something exceptional, which we'll discuss later. But I was thinking, it wasn't only due to his humility, because he recognized his master versus himself, and he saw himself only as in the shadow of his master. And whatever he was, it's because he attributed to his master. And that's exactly what it is. What was Eliezer, what was his understanding of his own value? Was it Zakam Beso? Moshe Shikolo? That wasn't his understanding. His value was that he was what? He was the servant of Avraham. I'll give you an example. A person is the right hand of a king, more than a personal advisor of a king. And this king is world renowned, and he personally is a wealthy man. When he travels around the world, and everybody knows he's the confidant of the king, and the king doesn't make a decision without him. And he's this advisor is phenomenally wealthy man, accomplished. How does he identify himself? Based on his own portfolio of wealth? No, because that pales compared to what he is versus the king. He is the confidant of the greatest king in the world. So therefore, everything else he understands has no value in reality. So for Eliezer himself, first of all, as I am the Eved of Avraham. Not I am the accomplished person. I oversee all my master's, all his holdings and all his assets. And I went to battle with him. Because all that means nothing, understanding who you are. I am the servant of Avraham. That's what it's all about. As Avraham said, Hashem be'erches Avraham Ba Kol. And Ba Kol means Ben, and everything else meant nothing. The wealth, nothing meant anything. Identically, Eliezer had an understanding of what the primary is and what secondary is. Therefore, how does he identify himself? Based on the primary. I'm the slave of Avraham. That's what it's all about. Everything else means nothing. As the Ba Kol by Avraham is everything, and the wealth and the renown and the fame means nothing, what it's all about is the Ba Kol is the Ben. Identically, he has understood what is it all about. I'm Eved Avraham Anochi. I'm the slave of Avraham. That's what it's all about. The Gemara tells us that the Pras, the Euphrates, is referred to as a Nor HaGodol Nahar Pras. The great Euphrates, the river of Pras, of Euphrates. So the Gemara asks, and Rashi cited earlier, when we spoke about the river that runs by Eretz Yisrael is referred to as the Euphrates, the great Euphrates. So the question is, Rashi cites the Medrash, it says there were 4 rivers that went out of Gan Eden, of the Garden of Eden. Euphrates was not the greatest of the rivers. So if it was not the greatest of the 4 rivers, why is the Euphrates referred to as Nar HaGodol Nar Pras? So it's a Gemara in Yuma, but Rashi cites it for the Medrash, that if you have a person, it's an ordinary person, but he is the minister of the greatest king in the world. It's irrelevant who he is in his personal life. How is he identified? He's identified by his function as the minister of the greatest king in the world. Since the Euphrates flows by Eretz Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael is Eretz HaKadosha, it's the most important location in the world, has the greatest value. Therefore, the river that's associated with that location is the greatest river. Not because of its physicality, but because of its association with Eretz Yisrael being the essence of everything. Therefore, it's referred to as a Nar HaGodol Nar Pras, the great Euphrates. Eliezer, regardless who he was personally, but because of his association and his representation and relation with Avraham Avinu, who am I? Eved Avraham Anochi. I am the slave, not the servant of Avraham. I'm the slave of Avraham. I'm the chattel of Avraham. Being that is everything. We just discussed that after Avraham purchased the Marsa Machpelah, it says, Vayokom HaSodeh, HaMeorah VaSodeh Vo'etz. Everything had an elevated status because it shifted from the domain of a commoner to the domain of royalty. What does that mean? Because once you attach and are associated to that source, it becomes a different dimension of being. Because now it's Avram's asset. Eliezer is Avram's asset. He is the chattel of Avram. Eved Avram Anochi. Being that is everything. That's the equivalent of Hanar HaGodol Nar Pras, the great Euphrates. You know, we read in Pirkei Avos, and the Rambam rules in Hilchos Talmud Torah, that there were 3 crowns given to Klal Yisrael. There was Kesed Kuna, Kesed Malchus, and Kesed Torah. 3 crowns. The crown of priesthood, the crown of kingship, and the crown of Torah. And the Rambam, it's based on the Mishnah Pirkei Avos, which crown is greater than all of them? The crown of Torah. And the Rambam quotes a pasuk, and the Mishnah quotes a pasuk. Because kings are coronated with the crown of Torah. You understand? You know what it means to be a king. You know what it means to be a high priest who goes into the Holy of Holies. Still, the crown of Torah is greater than everything. What do you mean? The man is sitting in the corner there. Nobody even notices him. Doesn't make a difference. You possess the crown of Torah, you have it all. And if you understand what the real crown is, then everything else pales to that crown. It's the same idea. If you have an understanding who Avraham Avinu is, even saying you're a slave, that's the ultimate compliment. That's the ultimate acclaim. I'm the slave of Avraham. The Euphrates, but it's not the biggest river. It's not the mightiest river. That's associated with Eretz Yisrael, which is Eretz HaKadosha. That's the ultimate. Therefore, the Torah identifies it as a Nar Hagadol, Nar Pras.